Today, we're going to start with macro indicators because, as far as I'm aware, that was what you guys were doing at the end of last year for macro. So obviously, there's a lot to cover there. We're not going to be able to do it all this hour, but obviously, we'll do as much as we can and pick some sort of more difficult areas. I'm going to start with some real basics, though, and start with this question, which I'm posing to you guys. You can't be shy now. You've got to put it in the chat, or you've got to speak up, or we'll just sit here for the next 2 minutes. And I'll have some coffee. But the question is, why do we have to spend all this time looking at how to measure things in macro? Like we didn't have to do that in micro. Think about it. We don't like we didn't have like sessions and sessions. Last year, I remember it took maybe 10, 12 lessons to teach all of measuring the macroeconomy, macro indicators. Why do we have to spend so much time measuring macro when we don't have to do that for micro? What makes it necessary that we do this in the first place? So answer in the chat or answers out loud, please. I will sip coffee until I receive something. Oh, Devin says to see if instruments are working. Rishi says because the macroeconomy is always changing. Harry also says maybe see if policies are working. So these are all good reasons, but that's not something that differentiates micro from macro, right? You might also want to measure the microeconomy to see if policies are working. You might also want to measure the microeconomy because it's always changing. So whilst those are relevant answers to measure it, it's not really answering the question, why do we have to spend so much more time doing it for macro? We don't teach you guys how to measure price. There's not like a 2-hour lesson on how price is measured. Hiti, well done. And Rishad, there's better answers, yes. So it's really about the scale of macro. Think about how much more complex the macroeconomy is compared to a market. Like microeconomics is the study of a single consumer, a single firm, or a single market. I'm not saying it's simple, but compared to studying the whole economy at once, which is every consumer in the UK, every producer in the UK, and every market in the UK, that's what the economy is basically. It's all the consumers, all the producers, all the markets just added together. So it's massively more complex. You've got all these different products being sold, all these different businesses and consumers doing different actions. So it's if you just think about it, it's incredibly difficult to work out what's actually going on with the economy as a whole compared to just what's happening in the market for shoes, what's happening in the market for I don't know football, what's happening in the market for everything. Really, really difficult. So we have to spend a lot of time like thinking about how do we measure economic growth? How do we measure inflation? Just because it's so complex to measure that in your place. So I think that's a good starting point for this topic, just because it makes you think about the difference between micro and macro, some of the challenges are a bit unique to macro, and a very top tip to like give you something easy and simple to note down is because it's very difficult to measure the macro economy. There's lots of problems in the way we do it. There's lots of imperfections, I should say. So the way we measure growth is not perfect. The way we measure inflation is not perfect. You can use that as eval quite easy. That's my tip. Is that limitations is a good way to put it. Limitations in the way we measure what's going on in the economy can be a good source of evaluation in A-level economics. So and more so in macro than micro, because again in micro it's just much easier to actually measure what's going on. All right, hope that makes sense. Any questions again? Chat, myself, whatever. So the second sort of basic thing I want to go through is just noticed one person join, and I just happened to look at that part of my screen at that time, so they lucked out. But we're going to go through the difference between value and volume, which is very, very small but very, very important. So in microeconomics, we are often thinking about two key variables, price and output. And price is obviously measured in money terms or currency terms, like price in pounds, price in dollars, price in whatever. So in macro, we are also interested in two key variables, lots of variables actually, but two sort of at a beginner level. And that is economic growth, which is sort of like economic output, and the price level. It's kind of like price. So we've got these two variables we're interested in that's very, very similar, but there's a key difference, which is that in micro, we look at the volume of output in a market. So how many units are being bought and sold, and that's on the x-axis in a micro diagram, supply and demand. And then in macro, we look at the value of output across all markets in the economy. So everything that's bought and sold, every good, every service, rather than just one. So the question I want to pose to you guys here is, again, why do we do this? What's this is another key difference between micro and macro. In macro, we basically ignore volume. We almost never talk about the volume of output or the volume of exports or something like this. We almost always talk about the value of the output instead. So what does that mean? Why do we do it? That's my question. Again, in the chat or on the stoves, whatever. Devin says, to see the success of all markets as a whole, why couldn't we use volume for that? Why don't we say the GDP of the UK is 13 billion units? We made 13 billion things this year. Why do we use the value? Why do we say the GDP of the UK is 13 billion pounds? So yes, it is to do with looking at all markets as a whole, but I guess my answer to you saying it's about the success would be, why can't we measure success through volume? Niati says, because the volume might remain the same, but the value could increase or decrease. Oh, possibly. I think I'm going to go to Vinesh's answer next, because that is the one that's really, really spot on. Because some goods are more valuable than others, right? And that you've in the macroeconomy, again, is really complex. You've got all these different goods with all these different values. So what's the problem with looking at the volume of a country's output? We can see if we use like a really, really simple example. Let's say we measure economic growth by volume. We've got country A and country B. Remember, economic growth is supposed to sort of indicate how rich a country is, how successful it is, blah, blah, blah. If I say country A produced 1,000 things, volume, or units, let me be a bit less vague, 1,000 units of stuff. Again, this is macro. We're not looking at one market. So this could be, they produced 50 cars and 50 planes and 900 t-shirts, I don't know. Whatever, and country B produced 100 units. So if we look at volume, country A is more successful, right? Its economy is larger, it's doing better. But again, what's the problem? Think about what Vinesh said. Some goods are more valuable than others. Okay, well done, Dev. What is the problem if we're using volume instead of value? Jane M says the value of 1,000 units will be less. Potentially. Good. Well done, Jenna. Yes, 100 units can still bring in more money. So it really depends on what the goods are. If it's micro, if we were looking at one market and this was 100 units of cars, sorry, 1,000 units of cars and 100 units of cars, then obviously country A is doing better because 1,000 cars is worth more than 100 cars. But because it's macro, volume is basically useless to us now. Because again, this could be like 900 cars and then 100 t-shirts, which is going to be pretty valuable. And this could be like 10 cars. Oh, sorry, I've really messed that up. Let's say one car, 999 t-shirts, which is not going to be very valuable. And then this could be 99 cars and one t-shirt. So when you're looking at the whole economy, because all the goods will have different values, looking at volume is basically useless now. Again, like I said, we never, if you hear the term output in macro, And again, to like simplify what I'm saying into like a key thing to write down, it's here. If you see the term output in macro, you should think value of output, not volume. And that's going to happen a lot. So when we say output in macro, we no longer mean how many units, we mean how much are they worth. And if I said like a car is worth £10,000 and a t-shirt is worth £5, we could then calculate the value, and that's basically what GDP is, right? The value of the output. So, okay, again, just clarifying that, and we're gonna look at the importance of this distinction with a quick question I've prepared. How lovely. So can someone just put in the chat whether this share screen has functioned effectively? You can all see multiple choice question. Yep, perfect. Okay, cheers, Rishabh. So this is an actual AQA past paper question, and I'm not going to let spend too much time with like you guys doing it because that'll just take ages. But I'm sort of going to explain the trick because it is a bit of a trick question. So it tells us the table below shows an economy's volume of goods and services imported and exported expressed as index numbers. So hopefully you guys are a little familiar with index numbers, but what this tells us is that the volume of exports fell by 10% in 2013 compared to 2012, 90 being 10% less than 100, and it fell by 10%, 20% in 2014 compared to 2012. So that's what it's telling us, but this is clearly volume, not value. So again, that's could be a very important distinction. So then it says, from the data, it can only be concluded that A, the value of the deficit in the balance of trading goods and services was 50 billion. I'm not sure if you guys have gone to deficit and surplus on the balance of trade yet, but anyone know, like, even though we might not know what that means, we can still say, well, answer A is completely irrelevant. It just cannot be answer A. Again, answers in the chat. We can just get rid of answer A. Not relevant. After 4 words. Good. Rishabh says it shows value. And what are we given? Are we given the value? Are we given what we need to calculate the value? Exactly right. Value is just not given. It's just not given. And a lot of students, when I've given them this questions like homework or things like this, they spend a lot of time kind of really thinking through like whether it can be A, like, oh, would this create a deficit? What's happening to exports? What's happening to imports? And that's the trap, basically, is they want you to waste time on this question. Or actually, if you're just really clear on the distinction between value and volume, you can get rid of, I think, 3 or 4 of the answers actually are just about value. So B says, apart from in 2012, there was a surplus in the balance of trades. So a surplus means when exports are greater than imports. And think about what I've told you guys so far about the difference between micro and macro. So a surplus, exports greater than imports. Do you think it's the value of exports are greater than imports or the volume of exports are greater than imports? It's a key macro objective. What do we care about in macro? You think we'd be more interested in exactly surplus value? Seeing a lot of people put that in the chat. Well done. Yes. So a surplus again is about value, and this is a key macro objective, having a surplus on the balance of trade. Again, what do we care about more in macro? Value. Volume doesn't really tell us that much about what's going on in the economy. So surplus is about value, so it can't be B because this chart shows us volume. It doesn't give us prices, so we can't calculate value. And C again talks about the value of imports increasing and the value of exports falling. So it's actually really easy. You don't even need to read like what E says other than volume. It says exports fell relative to imports, but it's the only one that can be true because it's the only one that talks about volume at all. So again, I really like this question just because it's actually quite simple and it just emphasizes they want you, right? They want you to know the difference between volume and value. and they might test you on that in a really, really simple way. But I promise you, a lot of people just get caught out there, and again, they waste loads of time, like checking through, calculating what's happened to exports and imports, blah blah blah.